Rumble and Slim aren't big snackers, but when they do request something, I usually make it. So today they requested some chips and guacamole and some popsicles. I got started on making my dough for my tortillas by combining some corn flour with some warm water before forming them into little balls and pressing them flat. I placed them in a hot skillet and fried them until they puffed up, and then transferred them over to a kitchen towel to keep them warm. In the meantime, I moved on to making my popsicles. I decided to make some lemon basil popsicles, so I juiced all of my lemons before moving on to making my simple syrup by combining some water, sugar, and a splash of maple syrup. I let that come to a boil, and while that was boiling, I finally chopped my basil. Once my mixture came to room temperature, I poured in my lemon juice and my basil before transferring it over to popsicle molds. Put the lid on top and popped these in the freezer for about 3 to 4 hours. And in the meantime, got started on making my guacamole. I mashed up some avocado and kept the pits in to keep it fresh before squeezing on some lime juice. I chopped up some tomatoes, some onions, and cilantro before putting all of that in the bowl with my avocado. I seasoned it with some salt, cumin, and some more lime juice before giving that a good mix, making sure everything is combined. At this point, I cut up my tortillas and fried them until they were golden brown, and while they were still hot, I sprinkled them with some salt. My kids couldn't wait, so I got the popsicles out and gave them one before plating the chips, and they absolutely loved it. My husband hasn't been home in a few days, but he's gonna be home in about 4 hours. So I decided to surprise him with a variation of one of his favorite desserts, which are cinnamon rolls. I had a bunch of raspberries at home, so I decided to make some raspberry lemon rolls. I started with my dough by combining some milk, sugar, butter, eggs, and then gradually adding in my flour. I made sure to mix it very well until it was all combined before pouring it out onto my counter and starting to knead it. I kneaded it for about 8 to 10 minutes until it was all smooth and came together before placing it in a bowl to rise. After about 2 hours, it had doubled in size, so I released all the air and then started on my filling. We kept this very simple with some brown sugar, cornstarch, and some frozen raspberries. Gave that a mix before sprinkling that all over my dough. I tried to get it as even as possible and then rolled it up and sliced it into equal pieces. I buttered my baking tray and placed my rolls inside, making sure that they weren't too close to each other, before covering them in cling film and letting them rise for another hour and a half. At this point, I preheated my oven and placed some more raspberries on top of my rolls before popping them in the oven for about 30 minutes. Baked them until they were golden brown and let them cool while I started on my frosting, which was some cream cheese, milk, powdered sugar, lemon zest, vanilla, and a squeeze of lemon juice. I mixed that all up and then spread that on top of my rolls. 30 minutes later, Lucky walked through the door, so it was perfect timing. I plated him one and he absolutely loved it. My parents are on a 10-hour flight over from Germany and they're about to land, so I decided to make them an early dinner for when they arrive at our house. Our friends brought us these potatoes from Idaho, so I thought it would be perfect making a duck fat roasted potato. I started by chopping them and boiling them while I got started on my maple roasted carrots. I cut my rainbow carrots in half and seasoned them with some olive oil, maple syrup, and some other spices. At this point, my potatoes were parboiled. I shook them up and transferred them over to a baking sheet with some hot duck fat before roasting them for about an hour in the oven. In the meantime, I got started on making a cilantro hummus and plated that before popping that in the fridge. Once that was set aside, I made my variation of a gremolata and added some green olives, dill, parsley, and also a red plum. I finally chopped my parsley and my dill before moving on to my olives and adding them to the plate. Last but not least, I also cut up my plum and added some olive oil, lemon juice, and some grated garlic to the mix. Seasoned with salt and pepper, gave that a good stir. By this point, my fish was ready to go in the oven, so I got started on the marinade, which was just some melted butter, some lemon juice, and a handful of other spices to go with the fish. Coated my fish in the marinade before putting it on a baking sheet and adding some tomatoes to roast as well. At this point, I was ready to plate, so I put my maple roasted carrots down on my cilantro hummus, topped my fish with some of the gremolata, but also put some extra on the side, plated my potatoes as well, and there we go, dinner was served. My dad loves a good potato while my mom loves a well-cooked fish, so this was perfect. Baking is something I'm really bad at. It's a massive science experiment that you have to get just right in order to get the right result. And for me, that's always a hit or miss, but I really want to learn how to make sourdough bread, so when my sister flew in, that was the first thing I wanted her to teach me, how to make a good sourdough loaf. We got our starter and started feeding it, and once it was ready, we made 2 loaves of sourdough bread. One thing I didn't know is how long it would take to do the stretch and folds and how it would take up our entire day, coming back to our dough every hour to stretch it. After about 4 to 5 hours, we were all done with the stretch and folds and turned our dough out, split it in 2, and decided on what flavors we wanted the loaves to be. We wanted a savory and a sweet one, so for the savory, we opted for a Parmesan lemon loaf. I was craving blueberries so bad, so we decided to also make a lemon blueberry loaf. We sprinkled that one with a little bit of brown sugar and then started forming it into a loaf by creating some tension in the dough. We popped that in the fridge for a little over 12 hours before scoring it and placing it in our Dutch oven with some ice cubes. Baked it and it came out so perfect. Needed a butter, so we made a whipped brown vanilla and maple butter, which went perfectly with how tart the blueberries were. Our savory loaf was proofing in the fridge for about 48 hours, so after 2 days it was ready to bake. I couldn't stop thinking about sticky chicken tenders all day long, and even though it was way too late to be in the kitchen cooking, I just couldn't stop thinking about it, so I decided to make it. I started off by making my own hot sauce by combining some Fresno chilies, garlic, peppercorn, some white vinegar, and letting that simmer on the stove until the chilies got soft. While that was simmering on the stove, I wanted something fresh to go with it, so I made a Brussels sprout and apple slaw. I thinly sliced my Brussels sprouts, cut my apples into matchsticks, and made a quick Dijon mustard vinaigrette. I combined some mustard, red wine vinegar, olive oil, salt, pepper, and then dressed my salad with it. I love crispy onions on salad, so I obviously had to top my slaw with that as well. I set that aside and moved on to making the breading for my chicken tenders. I cracked open some eggs, seasoned my flour and panko breadcrumbs before dipping my chicken in the flour, then the eggs, then the breadcrumbs, and repeating that before popping that in the oven. By this time, my peppers were soft, so I blended them up and then passed them through a strainer, and our hot sauce was done. For my sticky sauce, I combined some butter, the hot sauce, some brown sugar, and let that reduce on the stove until it thickened. And I pulled out my chicken, drenched it in my sauce, and it was time to plate. Put my chicken tenders down alongside my slaw, and this was so good. You know when a craving hits and you can't stop thinking about it? Ever since I started using the new Laneige watermelon pop lip sleeping mask, I've been thinking about having watermelon lavender sorbet. So today I just decided to finally make it, so I started by making a simple syrup by combining some water, sugar, and lavender. After letting that boil and steep, I transferred it over to a glass jar to cool off. In the meantime, I cut up my watermelon. Nothing screams summer more than having a good watermelon, so I cut it in half and then took the skin off before slicing it into little spears. Transferred them over to my blender, and I did this in batches, blended it up, and then strained it through a strainer. At this point, I added in my lavender simple syrup before giving that a good mix, adding some lemon juice and lemon zest. And I transferred it over to my ice cream churner and let that go until it got a little bit more solid. Couldn't resist trying some, so I had 2 scoops, and it was absolutely divine. My baby just got home from the hospital, and one thing that she has been asking me to make is chicken noodle soup. So today I decided to make it for her. I started by making my stock, so I cut up some carrots, some onions, some celery, and set that aside while I got a big pot out to put my chicken in. I used the whole chicken, but you can add whatever parts of the chicken you have laying around. I add all of my vegetables to the pot alongside some herbs and also a few cloves of garlic. I fill up my pot with some cold water before putting the lid on and letting that simmer away. After about an hour, I pull out my chicken and get the meat off, shred the meat and set that aside, and return the carcass back to my broth to simmer for another hour or 2. Once that was almost done, I started on my soup. I sliced up some celery, some carrots, and also diced up some onion. At this point, it was time to strain my broth, so I used a fine mesh strainer to get everything out. And then I added my vegetables to a separate pot. Sauteed them for a couple minutes before adding my broth and letting that simmer. In the meantime, I got started on making my egg noodles. I combined some eggs with some milk, whisked that up before adding some flour and then kneading my dough until it came together. I let that rest for about 10 minutes before rolling it out and cutting it into little squares, or might I say rectangles. I dropped them into my hot soup, let them boil for about 2 minutes before it was time to plate. I topped it with some parsley and lemon, and she absolutely loved it. My husband has a weird obsession with Takis and can't go longer than a week without having them. When he opened his bag of Takis today, he realized that they all went stale, so I just decided to make him some. I combined some corn flour with some water, salt, and some sugar before kneading it and letting it hydrate while I made my spice mixture. I combined habanero powder with cayenne pepper, paprika, citric acid, some red beet coloring to give it that really red color before setting that aside and dividing my dough into dime-sized pieces and rolling them into little balls. Once they were all rolled out, I made sure to cover them with a damp towel while I worked on one piece at a time. I put my dough in between some plastic before pressing it flat and rolling it into that signature Taki shape. And I kept repeating this process with all of my little pieces of dough. I then transferred them over to a plate while my oil was heating up. I made sure it reached 350 degrees before putting all of my chips in there and letting them get slightly more brown than I usually would. I tossed them in my spice mixture and then they were done. Since Takis are Lucky's favorite snack, he was so excited to try them and he was so shocked at how much they tasted like the actual thing, and that plate was gone in under 5 minutes.